It is 3 in the afternoon on a Friday in Jerusalem. The city is full. Passover has drawn hundreds of thousands of pilgrims from Egypt, from Babylon, from Rome, from every corner of the known world. The streets smell like lamb and smoke, and the particular tension that always fills Jerusalem when the crowds are this large and the Roman soldiers are this visible. Outside the city wall, on a hill called Golgotha, the place of the skull, 3 men are dying on crosses. The one in the middle has been up there since 9 in the morning. A crowd has gathered. The way crowds gather around suffering when they are not sure whether to feel grief or relief. Some of them are the same people who, 5 days ago, spread palm branches in the road and shouted his name. Some of them are the ones who, this morning, stood in Pilate's courtyard and shouted something else. Most of them are simply there, drawn by the spectacle of Rome's preferred method of humiliation, watching a man from Nazareth take his last hours in public. And then something happens that no one in that crowd can explain. The sun goes out, not clouds, not a storm rolling in from the Mediterranean. The sun, the same sun that has risen every morning of every human life since creation, stops giving light over Jerusalem for 3 hours in the middle of the afternoon. A historian named Thallus, writing just decades after this event, noticed the record of that darkness, and he tried to explain it. We will come back to what he said and why his very attempt to deny what happened became one of the most unexpected pieces of evidence for what actually occurred on that hill. But first, what you are about to see. In the span of a few minutes, after a carpenter from Nazareth breathes his last breath on a Roman cross, 7 things happen. Things that shook the ground, split the rocks, tore a curtain that 300 priests could not move, and caused a Roman soldier trained in the machinery of death to say something no Roman soldier was ever supposed to say. This is not mythology. This is not embellishment added by followers who wanted to make the story more dramatic. This is not coincidence assembled after the fact by people who needed the pieces to fit. 7 events recorded in 4 Gospels, confirmed by historians outside the Bible, foreshadowed in prophets who died centuries before this Friday afternoon. And every single one of them is a statement from the universe about what just happened on that cross. From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, darkness came over all the land. Matthew chapter 27, verse 45. The 6th hour is noon. The 9th hour is 3 in the afternoon. 3 hours of darkness at the brightest point of a Middle Eastern day over the land where the crucifixion was happening. Luke's account adds a detail that Matthew does not. He writes, the sun stopped shining. Luke chapter 23, verse 45. Not dimmed, not obscured by cloud cover. Stopped. Here is what most people miss. 700 years before this Friday, a prophet named Amos wrote these words, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. Amos chapter 8, verse 9. He was describing the judgment of God, the withdrawal of light as a sign that something of cosmic weight was happening. And here, on the day the Son of God dies, it arrives exactly as described. Noon, broad daylight, the sun stopped. Now, the historian, a man named Thallus, wrote a history of the Mediterranean world in approximately AD 52, just 20 years after the crucifixion. His original work no longer exists, but it was quoted by Julius Africanus, a Christian historian writing in AD 221. And Julius Africanus records something remarkable. Thales, a pagan, non-Christian historian, mentioned the darkness that fell during the crucifixion, and he tried to explain it as a solar eclipse. Julius Africanus refuted him immediately, and his refutation is one of the most quietly devastating arguments in ancient historical writing. A solar eclipse, he pointed out, is astronomically impossible during a full moon. And the Jewish Passover, the feast being celebrated in Jerusalem that very weekend, always falls on a full moon. You cannot have a solar eclipse during Passover. The mathematics of the solar system forbid it. Stay with me, because do you see what just happened? A non-Christian historian, writing 20 years after the crucifixion, tried to explain away the darkness by calling it an eclipse. He was not trying to confirm the gospel accounts. He was trying to find a natural explanation for a recorded event. But in doing so, in reaching for an alternative, he confirmed that the darkness happened, that it was real enough and widespread enough to have entered the historical record outside the Bible. The man who tried to deny the miracle proved the miracle occurred. For 3 hours, darkness covered the place where Jesus was dying. And somewhere in that darkness, on the cross, in a voice that Luke records as clear and deliberate, Jesus spoke his final words. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Luke chapter 23, verse 46. And then he was gone, and the universe responded. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Matthew chapter 27, verse 51. That sentence is 12 words in English. It takes less than 3 seconds to read, and it describes one of the most theologically loaded events in the entire Bible. To understand why, you need to know what that curtain was. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, not as a Christian, but as a careful recorder of the world he knew, describes the temple veil in his work, Jewish Wars. It was, he writes, a Babylonian curtain of blue and scarlet and fine linen of prodigious size. Scholars who have studied the temple architecture estimate it stood approximately 60 feet high and 30 feet wide. It was woven 4 inches thick. Josephus records that it required 300 priests to move it. Pay attention to this. This was not a decorative cloth hung for aesthetic reasons. This curtain, the katapetasma in Greek, was the boundary between the outer temple and the Holy of Holies, the innermost room, the place where the presence of God was said to dwell. And the rules governing who could enter beyond that curtain were precise, ancient, and absolute. One person, one day a year, the high priest, on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, he entered alone with blood from a sacrifice to make atonement for the sins of the people. Leviticus chapter 16, verse 2, records God's own warning. Do not come at just any time into the most holy place behind the curtain, or you will die, because I appear in the cloud over the atonement cover. The veil was not decoration. It was a statement. It said, you cannot come here. Not yet. Not directly. Not on your own terms. And then Jesus dies, and the veil tears, not from the bottom up, the direction human hands would work if someone were trying to tear it, not from the sides, from top to bottom, from the top of a 60-foot curtain that 300 men were needed to move. Something tore it from above. And hours earlier, in his final breath, Jesus had said one word that explains everything. John chapter 19, verse 30, tetelestai. We translate it as it is finished, but the word carries a precision that English cannot fully hold. Tetelestai was a commercial term in the ancient Greek-speaking world. When a debt was paid in full, when the transaction was complete, when nothing more was owed, the creditor would stamp the document with this word: paid, in full. The account is closed. The obligation is canceled. Jesus did not say, "I am finished," as a man at the end of his endurance. He said, "It is finished," as one completing a transaction. The debt the veil represented, the barrier between human beings and the presence of God, had just been paid. And 60 feet of woven curtain, 4 inches thick, tore from heaven downward to prove it. Now think about Caiaphas, the high priest of Israel, the man who had arranged Jesus' arrest, the man who had torn his own robes in the trial and called the claim of divinity blasphemy. On this particular afternoon, a Friday at Passover, Caiaphas would have been in the temple, close to the Holy of Holies, possibly within sight of the curtain, and the curtain tore. We have no record of what Caiaphas said or did in that moment. The Gospels do not tell us, but the Mishnah, the collection of Jewish rabbinic writings compiled after the destruction of Jerusalem, records something that the rabbis found deeply unsettling. For 40 years before the temple was destroyed in AD 70, they write, certain signs began to fail. The western lamp of the menorah would not stay lit. The temple doors opened by themselves. The lot for the scapegoat on Yom Kippur began consistently falling to the wrong side. 40 years before, AD 70 is exactly AD 30, the year of the Crucifixion. The rabbis who recorded these things were not trying to confirm the gospel. They were trying to explain a series of troubling omens. But the timeline lines up exactly. And then, the earth. At that moment, the earth shook. The rocks split. Matthew chapter 27, verse 51. The Greek word is seismos, earthquake. And it is the same word Matthew uses in chapter 28, verse 2, to describe the earthquake at the resurrection. 2 earthquakes. One when Jesus died, one when he rose, as if the earth bookmarked both moments and could not be still for either of them. The rocks split, not cracked, split. Creation, which had been made through him, responding to the death of the one through whom it was made. John chapter 1, verse 3. All things were made through him, and without him, nothing was made that was made. The rocks knew whose body was hanging on that cross, and they could not stay whole. And here, right here, is where Matthew records something that has quietly unsettled careful readers of the Gospels for 2,000 years. The tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. Matthew chapter 27, verses 52 and 53. Read that again slowly. At the moment of the crucifixion, tombs broke open around Jerusalem. And after the resurrection, 3 days later, people came out of those tombs, resurrected, and walked into Jerusalem and were seen by many people. Matthew records this in 2 verses and then moves on. He does not name the people. He does not describe the conversations. He does not tell us what happened to them afterward. He writes it as calmly as a man recording that it rained. And this is where it gets remarkable. Why does Matthew include this? He is not a sensationalist. His gospel is not given to embellishment for dramatic effect. He is a former tax collector, a man whose entire profession was built on precise, documented record keeping. When Matthew writes something, he writes it because it happened. So what does it mean? The early church fathers, men like Ignatius, who was personally trained by the Apostle John, understood these raised saints as the first visible announcement of what the cross had accomplished. Jesus died, and immediately the power of death began to crack. Not fully, not yet. The saints waited in their open tombs until after the resurrection to emerge. Matthew tells us, because Jesus had to be first. Paul writes in Colossians chapter 1, verse 18, he is the firstborn from the dead. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 20, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. First fruits. In the Jewish agricultural calendar, the first fruits were the first sheaf of the harvest, brought to the temple as an offering. They were not the whole harvest. They were the guarantee of the harvest, the proof that what was planted was going to come up. The saints who rose from their tombs around Jerusalem on that Friday were the first fruits of a harvest that will one day include every person who has ever died in faith. Jesus did not simply die and rise for himself. He broke something open. He cracked the door that death had held shut since the garden, and the cracked tombs of Jerusalem were the sound it made. Think of someone you have lost, someone whose absence still finds you in unexpected moments. A Sunday morning, a meal that you used to share, a voice you still sometimes expect to hear when you walk through a door. The resurrection is not a theological abstraction for that grief. It is a direct address to it, because what happened in those tombs outside Jerusalem on a Friday afternoon is the guarantee, the first fruits, that the grave does not have the last word over anyone who belongs to Christ. The crack in those tombs is the same crack that runs through every sealed place where death has been allowed to think it won. One of the soldiers, John tells us, pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. John chapter 19, verse 34. This detail appears only in John, and John adds something unusual. He insists on his own testimony here in a way he rarely does elsewhere. The man who saw it has given testimony, he writes, and his testimony is true. It is as if John anticipated that someone would find this detail hard to believe. For centuries, readers treated it as symbolism, and it is rich with symbolism. Blood and water as images of the Eucharist and baptism, of atonement and cleansing, of the two sacraments flowing from the body of Christ. The early church found layers of meaning in those two words. But in the 19th century, a physician named William Stroud published a study on the physical cause of the death of Jesus. He identified what modern medical understanding has confirmed. When the human heart undergoes catastrophic stress, the kind that occurs under conditions of extreme trauma, grief, and physical suffering, fluid can accumulate in the pericardium, the sac surrounding the heart. When the spear pierced Jesus' side at that angle, it would have passed through the pericardial sac first, releasing the watery fluid, and then through the heart itself, releasing the blood. Here is the part nobody tells you. The medical term for this condition is hemopericardium, and the informal description used by physicians to describe the rupturing of the heart under extreme emotional and physical stress is a broken heart. Literally, not metaphorically. The gospel writers did not have the medical vocabulary to describe what they were recording. John simply saw what he saw, and he was precise enough to note the sequence. Water first, then blood. 2,000 years later, a physician reads that sequence and recognizes it as the exact clinical signature of a ruptured heart. The one who bore the sin of the world, who took on himself in those hours on the cross something no human mind can fully calculate. died in the most literal medical sense of a broken heart. And then the soldier. He was a Roman centurion, a commander of 100 men, a professional whose entire career was built around one skill, knowing when someone was dead. He had watched hundreds of executions. He had administered many of them himself. He knew the physiology of dying, the sounds, the timing, the final stillness, the way a body looks when it is finished. This was not a man who could be fooled by unconsciousness or survival. He watched Jesus die. He watched the darkness come and the earthquake shake and the rocks split and the tombs open. He stood at the foot of the cross through all of it. And when it was over, Matthew tells us he was terrified. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." Matthew chapter 27, verse 54. Luke's version records him saying, "Surely this was a righteous man." Luke chapter 23, verse 47. Two accounts, two slightly different phrasings, and both of them from a man who had spent his career serving the empire that just executed Jesus. A man with no theological agenda, no community to impress, no religious framework that would lead him toward this conclusion. He simply said what he saw. Think about a person standing in a hospital waiting room. The moment the news arrives, the world outside the window is still moving. Cars are still driving. Someone is laughing somewhere down the hall. But in that room, in that person, everything has shifted. The universe did not announce itself to them. It simply changed inside them. What happened on Golgotha was different. The universe announced it. The sun stopped. The earth shook. The curtain tore. The rock split. The tombs opened. And a Roman soldier, a man whose loyalty was to Caesar, whose religion was Rome, whose career was death, looked at what just happened and arrived at the only conclusion the evidence permitted. Surely this was the Son of God. Not maybe, not possibly, surely. The Greek word is alethos, truly, in very truth, beyond doubt. The same word used when something has been confirmed past the point of uncertainty. A man trained in the certainty of death stood at the foot of a cross and became certain of something else. Now we return to Jerusalem. The crowd that gathered to watch has begun to disperse. Luke records something that no other gospel writer mentions, something quiet and devastating. All the people who had gathered to witness this sight saw what took place, and they returned home beating their chests. Luke chapter 23, verse 48. Beating their chests. In that culture, it was the gesture of grief and self-reproach, not the triumphant crowd that had called for his crucifixion this morning, not the jeering voices that had said, "Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." Walking home, beating their chests. Something had shifted in people who had not come to that hill prepared to be changed. The 7 events had done their work even on the people who did not understand them yet. Here is what they leave you with. First, not one of these 7 events was unannounced. The darkness was predicted by Amos 700 years before it fell. The torn veil was built into the architecture of Exodus. The curtain existed to be removed when the access it restricted had been paid for. The resurrection of the saints was anticipated in the first fruits imagery woven through the entire Old Testament. The earthquake appeared in prophecy. Every detail of Psalm 22, written by David 1,000 years before the crucifixion, maps onto the events of that Friday with a precision that cannot be explained by coincidence. Even the pagan historians who noticed the darkness were, without knowing it, filling in pieces of a picture that had been drawn long before any of them were born. The universe did not react in surprise. It reacted in recognition. This is what was always coming. This is what everything was pointing toward. Second, the veil is gone. 60 feet of woven curtain, 4 inches thick, torn from heaven downward. The boundary between human beings and the presence of God, removed, not frayed, not damaged, torn. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 19 and 20 say this plainly. We have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is, his body. The Holy of Holies is open. The access that the high priest received for 1 day a year in one room with blood that was not his own is now available to every person who comes through the torn curtain of his body at any hour, on any day, without an appointment, without a priest standing between you and God. And the question, the one the torn veil has been asking for 2,000 years is this: what are you still standing outside? What prayer have you not prayed because you were not sure you were allowed? What room have you not entered because you believed the door was for someone more qualified than you? The curtain is gone. The way is open. The debt is stamped tetelestai, paid in full. There is nothing left to qualify for. Third, and this is the one I want you to carry out of this video, a Roman centurion stood at the foot of a cross for 6 hours. He watched the darkness fall and the earth shake and the rocks split. He watched a man die in the way he had watched hundreds of men die. And when it was over, this soldier, this servant of Caesar, this man with no reason to say what he said and every professional reason to remain silent, opened his mouth and said the truest thing anyone said that day. Surely he was the Son of God, alethos, truly, beyond doubt, in very truth. A man trained in the certainty of death became certain of something the disciples had not yet found the courage to say out loud. And he said it standing under a darkened sky, on shaking ground at the foot of a cross. If a Roman soldier with no scripture, no community, no prior faith, nothing but what he had just witnessed, could arrive at that conclusion at the foot of the cross, then the 7 events that happened on that Friday afternoon have been waiting for you to arrive at the same one. Which of these 7 events landed hardest for you today? The darkness, the torn veil, the risen saints, or the centurion's words? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. Subscribe if this opened the crucifixion in a way you had never seen before. Share this with someone who has heard the story of the cross, but has never understood what the universe was saying in the minutes after Jesus died. And may the God who tore the curtain from top to bottom, the God who made the way open and the debt canceled and the tomb cracked, meet you today in the room you have been standing outside of. God bless you.